All right, welcome to class. This is Introduction to Political Ideas. I'm Ken Hicks. To this point in the semester, we've really been looking at three different ideologies and how ideologies treat human beings. Liberalism focuses on the idea of individuals as bearers of rights. Conservatives tend to view people as fallen and in need of restraint. And socialists view human beings as innately sociable and capable of doing far more collaboratively than in competition. They would like to change society to emphasize the collaborative aspects and to minimize the conflictual aspects that exist within human nature. So with this presentation, we're going to continue our discussion of socialism, and we're going to continue especially our focus on Karl Marx, who was really sort of a dominant figure. Kind of socialism leads up to and trails away from Karl Marx. Most socialists really feel like you have to reconcile your views of socialism with Marxism, and the irony that we call, that most Americans view socialism as synonymous with Marxism is something that a lot of socialists don't particularly like. So to return to Marx, we're talking about sort of his theories, and one of the critical aspects, we talked about his materialism and the fact that for Karl Marx, everything in human history is about how human beings organize themselves in order to produce the material goods needed for survival. And so now we're going to move on to talk about the social relations of production. And again, that refers to how human beings organize themselves. And so it is a requirement from back to the earliest when when anthropologists study, or archaeologists for that matter. Archaeological anthropology is a subfield of archaeology dealing with how ancient societies, based on what archaeological evidence we have, based on how they organize themselves. So for Marx, any attempt to survive requires cooperation, collaboration, and that inevitably leads to a division of labor to transform the material forces of production into useful goods. So just as in the ancient world and in some primitive societies today, you get the first rudimentary division of labor, which is between hunters who go out and attempt to kill larger animals for protein, and then you have gatherers who stay around close to where they are camped and attempt to identify herbs and other edible grubs and shrubs and things like that. Societies become increasingly complex as the material forces of production become more sophisticated. One of the big initial divisions, once you get from hunter-gatherer, then you begin to see kind of pastoral herd-based societies where they have domesticated certain animals, and they travel with their animals as a way of keeping pasture land, keep it from being overgrazed. Then, of course, you get the great technological innovation of agrarian societies. And again, with an agrarian society, it's much more, everything in a pastoral society is fairly communal. You slaughter an animal and you eat it collectively. But with agrarian society emerging, you begin to see, again, this is the first instance where people are really able to store additional value, and that is in the form of food. And really well into the feudal era, it's this idea that I can grab land, I can grow crops on it, and then I can store those crops. That gets me through the winter, and if I have enough of a surplus, I can sell it to other people. And so again, the complexity of society, from master slave to lord to serf, and then you get what Marx considers to be the current environment, which is the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. We'll talk more about these ideas when we get to a direct investigation of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. So the bourgeoisie are these folks who basically are the owners of the means of production. The proletariat are those people who work for the bourgeoisie. So the owners of the forces of production are the members of the dominant class. There are no more titled lords. For quite a while in the early modern era, the merchant class is one of the ways that they would buy themselves into relevance was to purchase titles of nobility. As you get into the 18th and 19th centuries, however, they recognize they don't really need that. They have money. And money is something that increasingly lords and kings absolutely have to have in order to, secure their political ambitions. So those who are the mere means of production belong to this subservient class. And as Marx will go on to suggest, there is more than one actual underclass. On top of all these things are kind of the rhetorical justifications, the ideological superstructure, that for Marx, basically this emerges after the fact. And this is how the dominant classes are able to legitimize and justify how the status quo operates. So again, these are the sets of ideas, ideals, and beliefs that cause people to think that this is the way things are, and this is the way things will always be. And for Marx, of course, one of his more memorable lines is, "The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas." And so the bourgeoisie's overriding interest lies in portraying their dominance as normal, as natural, and indeed as inevitable. And again, this follows what we might call the naturalistic fallacy that Aristotle engaged in basically saying that some people are simply slaves by nature. See, they're slaves, therefore it is their nature to be servile. I think Marx would sneer at that kind of logic. From this idea that ideological superstructures really just are rationales, Marx was fairly dismissive of religion and described it as the opiate of the masses. This emerges in Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right in 1843, which is where he's really settling accounts both with the right and the left Hegelians, basically arguing you guys are just dancing on the heads of pins, arguing about really irrelevant things. So, it's important to keep in mind, and Marx was quick to point out that Christianity had long held that slavery as an institution had been ordained and blessed by the Christian church, and was viewed as, again, a natural institution, something that God created, therefore we could not bring it under question. In modern times, people internalize religious ideas that legitimize poverty and exploitation. We talked about this in one of our previous, when we were talking about the ideology of Silicon Valley, this long-termerism, basically suggesting that, we shouldn't care about poverty right now because we really have much bigger fish to fry. We have, saving the world from all these, future calamities that may happen in, 250,000 years. And so religion, according to Marx, dulls the minds of the proletariat and leaves them incurious as to the sources of their misery. And of course, what he's really talking about is this idea that religion simply justifies misery. It creates this sense of, justice is not in this world, right? That we have to wait for the next world for our blessings. He also argues that state-sponsored education valorizes capitalism and normalizes poverty. And again, it gets back to some Christian doctrines. The poor shall always be with us. Many conservatives make that argument and say that attempts to reduce poverty are in effect, derangements of economic relations that are harmful to society. Another important concept within Marx's theory is this notion of false consciousness. And again, the whole point of this ideological superstructure is basically to deny to the proletariat an unadorned view of reality. You create, you drop a veil of ignorance in front of the workers. And so for Marx, the proletariat is suffering from this kind of false consciousness. They lack awareness of their own interests and of their own revolutionary potential. And so, again, the challenges, and this is something that really, again, dogs Marxian and subsequent Marxist theories, and that is, the challenges inherent in an entire class of people overcoming false consciousness. That is one of the great puzzles of Marxist theories. And of course, for Marx, he would simply say, well, Hegel points out that people will just eventually, the veil will be dropped. That at some point, people will just come to a realization that they are being exploited and that they will subsequently rise up. That is one of the deepest flaws to me in Marx's moral psychology. He is insufficiently attentive to the fact that, the proletariat may be exploited and they may be aware of it. They may also be aware that they could be doing a lot worse. And that they are oftentimes, Marx was himself kind of dogmatic in believing that the logic of capitalism would inevitably and steadily immiserate the proletariat. Well, capitalism ultimately has demonstrated a lot of ability to save itself. The fact that, in the early 20th century, Henry Ford, basically said, I'm going to pay people a salary sufficient so that they can buy their own product. That was not something that Marx thought capitalism could do, that he believed that this inevitable logic of capitalism would always steadily immiserate the proletariat in the search for ever enlarging profit. So let's move on to talk about Marx's critique of capitalism. He points to this idea of transitioning of capitalism as being a revolutionary force that is driving out feudalism to becoming a decayed system of oppression. And again, I think part of the problem with Marx's analysis is that he's sort of hitting fast forward on history. He is basically saying that capitalism, which really had only been in place for less than a century at the time that he was writing, had suddenly become outmoded. Well, feudalism lasted for, almost a millennium. The ancient world lasted for several millennia. It's hard to say as a scientific matter that an economic system is destined to decay and to fail. That is part of the kind of the part where the synthesis between Hegelianism and social science and economics fails Marx. He becomes too much of a Hegelian and doesn't note this extent to which he is trying to force things. And this is something, again, that Marx was capable of self-reflection, but he was so committed to this, glorious synthetic architectonic set of theories that he elaborated, that he simply wasn't able to see beyond, the logic that he had put in front of, that he had kind of promulgated. So he points out that originally capitalism had three basic kind of progressive functions. And the first is this idea of accelerating the extinction of feudalism. Commerce, which was the lifeblood of capitalism, opened new trade routes to Africa and Asia. You have Columbus's voyages of discovery in America. Capitalism has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound men to his natural superiors. And so again, the suggestion here is that Marx is pointing out the extent to which capitalism just demonstrated how inefficient feudalism was. And even as, people clung to those, and again, it's important to keep in mind, I believe that human beings are innately conservatives. They would prefer to huddle on the cliff than leap into the dark. Because sometimes an unpleasant reality that you know how to work is better than wandering off and starving or falling prey to nature itself. And so capitalism basically forges a way forward for humanity and basically says, in part, and it's important to keep in mind, part of why feudalism failed was that, 2/3 to 3/4 of human beings in Europe were serfs. They had no political rights. They were effectively villains, which the original meaning of villain meant tied to the land and to the lord that owned the land. So they could dispose of you however. When we talk about some of the early, the Magna Carta, for example, the Magna Carta really only applied to the relationship between King John and the English nobility. The English nobility could do whatever they wanted to their serfs. They could rape the women on their, on their land. They could kill a villain out of hand without any legal consequence. And so, capitalism is doing a good thing, according to Marx, in doing away with that kind of social order. A social order, remember, that the reactionaries, many of the reactionaries, what was his name? The French reactionary, believed was absolutely the natural way to do things. The second function is it facilitates humanity's mastery over nature. It's the first economic system that to maximize humanity's productive capacities. And if you remember, St. Thomas More, basically Marx is kind of playing a similar card. He's saying, instead of More is saying, if we simplify, we'll have plenty. Marx is saying, if we produce like crazy, we'll have plenty. And the idea that Marx is driving here is that what will happen is that capitalism will ultimately subdue nature, and eventually humanity will be able to so massively overproduce that they no longer need to compete for access to goods. So that things like money will no longer be necessary. We will have superabundance. And so what Marx is positing, and we'll get more to this when we think about his theory of the revolutionary sequence, when the proletariat takes over, according to Marx, they will be taking over a capitalist system that they will effectively preserve. The ability of capitalism to produce superabundance will be retained under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, the actual workings of socialist revolutions of the 20th century have suggested otherwise, that in fact, when totalitarian rulers like Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot took over countries and attempted to reorder their economies, they actually destroyed their economies. Okay? And so this quote from Marx is telling. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all the preceding generations together. And he's not wrong. I mean, he is basically suggesting that the Industrial Revolution has produced enormous wealth, far more wealth than anybody thought was possible. The third is, again, that's important and progressive, is that capitalism creates enormous incentives for innovation and change. The restless search for efficiency and the search for profit. This efficiency imperative brings about changes in the social relations of production due to the conditions of uncertainty. All that is solid melts into the air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Now, he's also arguing that this constant and relentless search for innovation is what also produces the steady immiseration of the proletariat. And again, I can hearken back to my presentation about the founders of Silicon Valley. When Silicon Valley was in its most productive phase, it was massively innovative. And they have continued to kind of burnish their reputation as these great innovators. But increasingly, the question, you're bringing into question both the utility of many of these innovations, and also the potential threats posed by the emergence of really potentially destabilizing technologies like artificial intelligence and cryptocurrency. These are things that could produce tremendous advances, revolutionary advances, or it could destroy us. That's kind of an all or nothing scary prospect that maybe a small group of egotistical narcissists maybe shouldn't be making. I'm just saying. So what is Marx's critique of capitalism? Capitalism, he argues, is outmoded. And again, he's trying to hit that fast forward button. Once a progressive force, capitalism today has outlived its utility and now impedes its human freedom. Capitalism is akin to adolescence in humanity's evolution toward a higher form of society. And of course, I posted Corinthians 13:11. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. This is what Marx is basically suggesting, though Marx is no Christian. He is also saying that capitalism contributes to human alienation. Now, alienation is something that there is a cottage industry within socialist thought. There are lots and lots of articles about alienation and how alienation, is deployed by Marx to basically argue the essential injustice of capitalism. So he's arguing basically that vast swaths of humanity are alienated from their labor, from other workers, and from themselves. And this sense of alienation contributes to capitalism's downfall. That he makes various metaphors in his writings that are really, he talks about, the proletariat is the fetus of revolution. He argues that the bourgeoisie provide their own grave diggers. This is very rich, evocative language, again saying that the essential injustice of capitalism creates the impetus for its downfall. And so, and he also argues that the bourgeoisie themselves are alienated, that they become, much like in the master and slave parable, someone like Andrew Carnegie becomes nothing but a slave master, a driver, someone who is pursuing nothing but wealth for wealth's sake, to the point where he actually, and again, kind of the life arc of Andrew Carnegie proves that Marxism isn't, that the dogmatism and determinism of Marxism is not always borne out, because of course Carnegie has a late, a crisis of conscience and undertakes to basically redistribute much of the wealth that he created. When you think about Bill Gates basically committing that he's going to give away all of the billions that he has amassed. These are reflective of the possibility that within capitalism there are saving maneuvers. It may be that Marx's diagnosis of the problem of capitalism is correct, but that he's drawing conclusions that are unwarranted. So if you look at this slide, these are the four dimensions of alienation, right? For Marx, the proletariat workers are alienated from the product of labor. They're forced to sell their labor and do not own either the means of production or what they produce. In fact, until well into the 20th century, most laborers could not afford the goods that they were producing. The worker is also alienated from the activity of production. Mass production kills the creative spirit. They're only, drilling in a cog in a machine. It denies workers the satisfaction of seeing a product through to conclusion. Workers become an appendage to a great machine. They're alienated from their creative powers. The power to create and enjoy beauty is dulled or remain undeveloped. The powers to freely cultivate capacities for self-creation and self-realization are debased and reduced to base survival instinct. Think about, at the time that Marx was writing, people who were working in factories were oftentimes working 16-hour days. They had 8 hour, about 8 hours left of the day with which to themselves. And when you've been working for 16 straight hours, what does that leave you? Do you have the energy left to read a book, to raise your children, to sit around and discuss the affairs of state? You have no leisure time, because much of that time you have to be sleeping because you're exhausted and you have to get ready for the next day. There was a 6-day work week. They rarely had any days off other than Sunday. Finally, workers are alienated from their fellow workers. The forces, capitalism forces workers to compete with other workers for jobs, and the competition for jobs in turn drives down wages, contributing to this cycle of immiseration. Finally, the third critique is that Marx is arguing that capitalism is self-subverting. The scientific logic of capitalism holds all of humanity in its grip. The logic of capitalism compels the bourgeoisie to seek profit regardless of the human costs. And there, on this slide, I'm using the metaphor of capitalism red in tooth and claw. The phrase originates in a poem by Alfred Tennyson and refers again to the ruthlessness of nature and its indifference to the fate of individual members of any particular species. Applied to capitalism, the phrase suggests again that capitalism supplants nature, but is equally indifferent to the cruelty the system imposes on entire classes of workers and indeed on the bourgeoisie. The logic of capitalism, according to Marx, is that both bourgeoisie and proletariat are compelled to play their respective roles, and that even the owners of the means of production are trapped within the logic. So to offer a more contemporary example, imagine there are two factories owned by competing capitalists, both producing steel. One of the capitalists, let's call him the good capitalist, decides one day he'll significantly improve the working and living conditions of his worker. He gives them raises, shortens the workday, improves the working conditions, installs safety equipment, adds a clinic and a daycare center for workers with kids. His competitor, let's call him the bad capitalist, does none of those things. As a result, the rising costs and shrinking productivity of the good capitalist factory drives him out of business. His competitor buys his factory, and the former capitalist finds himself applying for a job in the factory he previously owned. The so-called bad capitalist actually benefits from his uncompromising behavior. He now owns another factory and he's gained a larger market share of the sale of steel. When other capitalists behave like him, they inexorably move closer to cornering the market on their product, producing a monopoly where one powerful person or company or cartel enjoys exclusive control over the production and sale of a good or service. And so the problem for Marx is that both worker and capitalist are alienated from their full development as human beings. For Marx, this alienation means that capitalism creates its own gravediggers. And Marx believed that the 19th century factories of Europe would become the schoolrooms of revolution. And so let's look at the, it's a relatively short, it was a pamphlet written again in 1848 by Marx and Engels. The Communist Manifesto. And it begins with this very stirring opening stanza. A specter is haunting Europe. The specter of communism. It's very Rousseauian, kind of the essay on inequality. Man is born everywhere free and yet lives in chains. Again, the political context of this period were the revolutions of 1848. Marx and Engels were both seeking to capitalize on that revolutionary spirit. If you look at all the little dots on this little map here, that shows you all the places where there was government takeovers, people storming government businesses, people fighting in the streets with soldiers. Marx describes a holy alliance of reactionary forces to suppress communism. He doesn't really say what it is. Among those reactionary forces, Marx included the Catholic Church, the Russian Tsar, Clemens von Metternich, the Chancellor of the Austrian Empire, Francois Guizot, the conservative Prime Minister of France, and the German police spy, which was a personal thing for Marx because he was constantly shadowed by police, informants who kept tabs on Marx. He was believed to be a threat to the state, and of course he had been hounded out of Germany and then Cologne, and then Germany, Paris, and then Cologne by then Prussian police spies. And again, we have the first key section of the Communist Manifesto, and it again is this important phrase: the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. And here you see, I think, in many ways, the interworkings of Marx and Engels. Marx was the much deeper thinker. I'll talk more about that in a subsequent presentation. But Engels was the better writer. Engels was the more concise thinker who is able to put very complex ideas into very simple form. And so Marx and Engels are basically describing this historical narrative of the movement of class conflict from ancient feudal to capitalist societies. And they're also making this argument that class antagonisms become simplified with each kind of revolution. The serfs of the medieval period used the refuge of the guild towns to become chartered burghers. And the burgher class in medieval Europe were the free subjects of the guild towns, which were key points of commerce that were granted certain rights by the lords owning the land because of their ability to produce critical commercial goods that the nobility wanted or needed. And so serfs who escaped to guild towns and maintained their freedom for a period of time, usually roughly a year, were released from their villanage and became free. Okay? And so Marx notes this and says, again, as the European population grew, the closed guild system was unable to provide the growing demands for new and expanded marketplaces, and again, for larger and larger percentages of the people who were no longer serfs and who had money and wanted to buy things. And so the impetus of all this is the rise of modern industry. Steam and machinery would revolutionize industrial production. And what were they doing? They were mainly making clothing, right? Because the great driver of the English industrial revolution was this notion that you move people into towns. The nobility would be shearing sheep, and they would be sending that wool and other materials into the big factory towns to convert that wool and those other materials into clothing. And so there was a time when most people wore the clothes that were spun in their home. That was the whole notion of homespun clothing. You see that in a lot of description. For example, early 19th century America. Again, most of the clothing was homespun. Increasingly now you have factories doing that. And so small cottage industries were sacrificed by these huge factories, controlled increasingly by people who are, what's happening when you're able to make so much clothing and harness so much labor? Well, you're making enormous profits. And so the economy of scale creates the modern bourgeoisie, the people who control the commanding heights of industry. And then you have, of course, the voyages of discovery that pave the way for the dramatic expansion and interconnection of the industrialized economy. And again, here you're looking, we talk about globalism a lot in international relations. And really, globalization occurs at various points in human history. And this is another point where the voyages of discovery, not only, what's happening too is there's more and more people who recognize that being able to use the sea lanes can be a profitable and lucrative line of business. You see enormous expansion of smuggling of goods. And that, again, gives rise to a much freer economy because, what are they smuggling? They're smuggling stuff that rich people want. right? People in England wanted French and Italian wines. They wanted Spanish olive oil. They wanted saffron. They wanted stuff that they couldn't grow in England. And so that growing interconnectivity and interdependence is what is again, it's a transforming force in capitalism. Bourgeois ascendance. Remember, the bourgeoisie began as these burghers who were effectively an oppressed class dominated by a feudal nobility. Subsequently, they emerge as an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune. Those guild towns were able to defend themselves from incursions by nobles seeking escaped serfs. Here they emerge as an independent urban republic, as in Italy and Germany. There as a taxable third estate of the monarchy, as in France. And we could talk about how the taxable third estate really created problems for France that led to the revolution. The bourgeoisie often acted as a counterweight in the service of either monarchy or nobility in the early modern era. But with the establishment of modern industry, the bourgeoisie seizes the modern representative state. And to the extent that government is representative, it is representative of the interests of the bourgeoisie, of the wealthy. And keep in mind, those early areas where you saw representative democracy emerge. Think about England, for example. The party system that emerged, there was no workers' party in the early 19th century in England. There were the Tories, who were the party of the landed nobility, the agrarian landed nobility, and then there were the Whigs, who were the party of the mercantile elite. So what you saw within one of the early party systems in democratic, reputedly democratic politics, are really competing factions of political elites. So again, Marx concedes the bourgeoisie is originally a revolutionary force. Capitalism has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. What a great line. I guarantee you Engels had something to do with that. Another great quote, the bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. And again, he's speaking of the extent to which, especially among these merchant classes, that very frequently marriages were more about alliances than about romance and than about romantic love. The bourgeoisie have demonstrated what humanity's activity efficiently harnessed can achieve. And so then he goes on to begin talking about, again, this force, the extent to which capitalism is this engine that runs and is inexhaustible. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed relations informed by custom and prejudice are swept away. All new formed relations become antiquated before they can ossify. And this again reflects the extent of the way Silicon Valley did things. When you think about computer technology, and for that matter, consumer goods. I remember walking around with these little disc players, and these days everything is Walkmans or whatever they were. These days everything is so much more efficient because, innovation, constant, relentless innovation. Marx would write, all that is solid melts into the air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. I already gave you that quote, but I think it bears repeating. Marx is foreshadowing globalization. The relentless innovations of capitalism also are sweeping aside the particularities of nationalism. National one-sidedness and narrow-minded become more and more impossible. And from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. And then you have, what he's describing and what later economists would describe as the creative destruction of capitalism. And that's a term actually that was coined by an Austrian political economist by the name of Joseph Schumpeter, who was born in 1883, the year Marx died, and lived until 1850. His Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy in 1942 referred again to basically what he described as an interactive process of capital accumulation and annihilation. So in contrast with Marx, Schumpeter argued that the constant out with the old, in with the new nature of capitalism would not only inevitably produce the kinds of crises that Marx predicted, but for Schumpeter also it would be beneficial because it would contribute to the breaking up of monopolies and concentrations of wealth, paving the way for new avenues to wealth creation that would be a beneficial engine. Less about capitalism red in tooth and claw, and more about capitalism constantly reinventing itself. And so the bourgeoisie, he writes famously, the bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the town. Here he's describing the great movement of workers from agrarian settings to industrial settings. And the result for Marx was an enormous expansion of cities that has rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. And of course, Marx he believed that rural life was basically an extension of feudalism, an extension of a backward way of living, and inevitably was fraught with all kinds of human, kinds of perversions, if you will. With the fact that more and more people are living in cities comes naturally political centralization. The necessary consequence of people moving into these large, huge factory towns was that you would have political centralization. Where feudalism permitted independent and loosely connected provinces, capitalism demands one nation with one government, one code of laws, one frontier, and one customs tariff. The conditions of the bourgeois society are too narrow and so justifies both creative destruction and the conquest of new markets. And here, of course, he is talking about colonialism, about the English and the French, basically conquering territories and yoking those territories to the needs of the central country. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground will now be turned against itself eventually. And now he's talking about the proletariat, the commodification of labor. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Screw in that widget. The conversion of small workshops into the great factory of the industrial capitalist and the working of capitalism gradually reduces the intermediate classes, the middle class, if you will, to the great class of the proletariat. All become instruments of labor. The modern industry is the great equalizer. The less skill and strength that's required, the more that labor is superseded by women. Women are increasingly brought into the workforce. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are immiserated equally. The proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. Remember, the small shopkeeper eventually loses their shop. Think about the days when the middle class of a small American town was the guy that owned the warehouse goods store, the small tool shop and things like that. Those are gone. Now you have Walmart, Lowe's. The members of the middle class are middle management in larger national corporate concerns. He argues that the proletariat go through stages of development, and first labor directs their attacks not against the bourgeoisie, but the instruments of production themselves. Next, they fight the enemies of their enemies, and by this he's talking about the remnants of monarchical absolutism, the aristocracy, and the non-industrial bourgeois like farmers and the petite bourgeoisie. Next, labor gets organized against the bourgeoisie and form trade unions. But for Marx, at this point again, the proletariat remains divided within itself, and factionalization, which he was deeply embroiled in his time, remains a major obstacle to the critical point of consciousness raising, where the proletariat collectively reach the conclusion that capitalism is fundamentally unjust. And the bourgeoisie will never give them a fair deal, because under the rules of capitalism they can't give them a fair deal. And so for Marx, trade unions were maybe again a necessary first step, but eventually they would need to go beyond this sense in which they're simply providing for a sense of representation, right? Because remember, his next to end point is the dictatorship of the ruling class. Once the proletariat reaches revolutionary class consciousness, a small section of the bourgeoisie will break away and join the revolution. That's the sort of pronouncement, again, that he's predicting things that will happen. And they may be intuitively true or intuitively appealing, but it has more to do with prophecy than with science. And again, it's reflective more of his commitment to Hegelianism than to economic science or anything else. He notes the existence of the lumpen proletariat, which he describes as the dangerous class. The small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, they fight to save themselves as part of the middle class, but they're easily manipulated to serve bourgeois ends. For Marx, the lumpen proletariat will always be essentially conservative or even reactionary. At times, the lumpen proletariat may be swept up within the proletarian revolution, but for the most part, its conditions of life prepare it more for the part of bribed tool of reactionary intrigue as scabs or strikebreakers, rather than as revolutionaries. And again, this is why, in no small part, Marx, who read widely, he actually wrote a number of articles covering the American Civil War between 1860 and 1862 for both the New York Herald and a German newspaper called Die Presse. And he came to the conclusion that the United States would be one of the last places where he would expect a workers' revolution to take place, for the very simple reason that the United States was a pure, distilled version of capitalism. And there were far too many lumpen proletariat. He would say the same thing about Russia. He basically said that the vast population of serfs more resembled the lumpen proletariat than any kind of worker. He was dismissive of the notion that the serfs would become revolutionary material. And so over time, Marx is arguing that the proletariat will become the universal class. And again, he makes the argument that the bourgeoisie is essentially unfit to be a ruling class. The development of modern industry cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates politics. What the bourgeoisie produces above all is its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. And again, there's no science involved in that kind of prediction. If not, there's a heck of a null hypothesis. So what is it that communists want? Communists are dedicated to the unification of the entire proletariat. Their principal aim is the abolition of bourgeois property, not the abolition of property. Remember what I said earlier. They want to hold on to the productivity of capitalism, They simply wanted to fundamentally revise ownership. The person must be swept out of the way and made impossible. Abolition of the bourgeois family, abolition of the idea of national boundaries. The working men have no country. And again, he argues the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of the ruling class. And eventually, he argued the ruling ideas of the coming age will be the ruling ideas of the proletariat. So how does this translate into the revolution that he is predicting? And again, Marx is predicting, he's really deterministic about the idea that eventually there's going to be a revolution. And so he's basically saying all these ingredients, once they're in place, it's just like a pressure cooker. Sooner or later, enough pressure builds and the top will come off. So in essence, Marx is retelling Hegel's parable. Capitalists and workers are the characters trapped in the master-slave drama whose plot they don't fully know and whose role they don't fully understand. Workers begin with a sense of gratitude and dependence on the capitalist. Workers generally accept the capitalist worldview and the ideology which justifies the economic order. The relationship appears reciprocal. The worker performs tasks, and in return, the capitalist pays the worker a wage. But the worker is denied all the information they need to make a complete to arrive at a complete understanding of the relationship, because the bourgeoisie are basically using subtle means to extract surplus labor. And here again, Marx is accusing capitalists of systematically undervaluing work in order to create profit. Workers are steadily impoverished while the capitalist lives in luxury. The lives of Engels and Marx are really kind of reflect this kind of parable. Because while Marx lived in poverty, and Engels did help him, he helped him get work, he helped him with cash every now and then, he nevertheless kept him pretty poor. Whereas Engels, who was a wealthy industrialist, was a routine. He attended plays, he partied, he drank a lot, he smoked a lot. He chased a lot of women. And so in the Communist Manifesto, increasingly what becomes clear is the relationship between the capitalist and the worker is a zero-sum relationship. The more the capitalist wins, the more the worker loses. And he's again arguing that this is pretty deterministic. This is not going to change. This is simply going to intensify. Because capitalists cannot revise what they're doing and say, well, I won't abuse these folks, I'll pay them a fair wage. And so for Marx, you would have a dawning realization. The fault lies not with the worker, but with the system. Workers collectively begin to realize the dependence of the capitalist on their workers. And here he's foreshadowing of the power that strikes would have in the latter half of the 19th century and certainly in the early half of the 20th century. Workers begin to realize that the pathway to freedom lies in the abolition of both classes, the elimination of both proletariat and bourgeoisie. And so the proletariat, according to Karl Marx, is the first universal class. The proletariat is the only class with a primary interest in its own self-abolition. By serving its own interests, the proletariat serves humanity's interests. By freeing themselves, workers also emancipate the capitalists who are equally denied the power of self-realization. And so for Marx, freedom can only come in a classless society where all of these gradations are swept away. And again, think about how that contrasts with the way, people in Silicon Valley think, or conservatives for that matter. This is, what he's basically arguing is leveling to a conservative. And so Marx, again, is offering a prediction that the great proletarian revolution would be, would occur and begin in more advanced capitalist countries. And so if you look on this slide, you're looking at basically what he considers to be how things are going to happen. You'll start with economic crises, the steady immiseration of the proletariat, the establishment of revolutionary class consciousness, the seizure of state power, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the withering away of the state, and then finally you get capitalism. So when you're talking about economic crisis, Marx is, again, he's forecasting that the boom and bust nature of capitalism will continue to intensify and get worse over time. It's inevitable. They can't be improved upon, again, because of this ineluctable, remorseless logic of capitalism. And so what would steadily happen over time is that each time, and again, if you understand, and Marx understood this because he studied the classical economists, what causes an economic panic typically is that the economy is oversupplying what's, the demand for a good. And that malinvestment in overproduction actually produces the kind, again, because if you're overproducing something, what are you going to do? You're going to stop making it. So the prices would go up. That means you're going to lay off or furlough significant numbers of people. That creates unemployment. Unemployment, if you're unemployed, you don't have much cash, so you can't spend as much money. And so that leads to a contraction in business activity. Marx understood how that worked. But dogmatically, he believed that there was nothing that government, or certainly that the bourgeoisie that government represents, could do about it. And so he's arguing that it's almost mechanistic, that each tide of economic crisis would leave a few workers in a worse off situation. And so the more mature a capitalist economy, the more these crises will occur, and the less effective will be the corrections designed to try and keep things in a more status quo situation. The immiseration of the proletariat, again, while the bourgeoisie survive and often benefit from these economic crises, the workers continue to suffer. When you think about, various dot-com bust, the attacks of 9/11, there were people out there like Donald Trump at the time who were saying, hey, there's some real estate I can buy. People of the bourgeoisie, there are certain folks that have enough money that they can basically say, I can buy stuff now cheaper than I could before. So in these crises, workers exposed to unemployment must also often resort to other means to survive. And again, the immiseration of the proletariat was viewed by Marx as an inevitable feature. Marx did not anticipate the kinds of government interventions that would lead to the creation of the welfare state, which I have noted predominantly was a conservative phenomenon. Subsequent revolutionary Marxists like Vladimir Lenin would express contempt for welfarism precisely because it short-circuits the immiseration of the proletariat. Next, you would get revolutionary class consciousness. The experience of these contradictions, these things that don't fit, would lead to a spreading realization of the increasingly unjust nature of capitalism. Marx would argue that communists are playing a midwife role for the revolution, providing a theory, an explanatory framework, explaining the untenable nature of capitalism. The reason why Marx's predictions of a global proletarian revolution have not been realized are, you can see them, right? Persistently, the formation of revolutionary class consciousness has failed to manifest among working classes. In part, this reflects the extent to which workers from one country simply do not identify with workers from another country. Additionally, even within countries, workers are often divided among themselves on matters related to politics. In many countries, some of the most politically conservative members of society are often the working class. Workers broadly have been resistant to radicalization because they are risk averse. The political elites have often proven to be quite adept at co-opting large swaths of working class voters with promises of social welfare programs. This resistance to radicalization has led subsequent Marxist revolutionaries to identify solutions to this particular problem. As we'll learn in our next presentation, Vladimir Lenin, the Russian revolutionary, would basically argue there needs to be a vanguard party that will herd and goad the revolutionary classes to achieve revolutionary class consciousness. Next, you will have the seizure of state power. You have a combination of objective economic conditions and subjective conditions like revolutionary class consciousness. This could be initiated with spontaneous collective actions. Marx hypothesized that it could be a grassroots explosion of protests that might include wildcat strikes, boycotts, demonstrations, riots that just persist. For example, a lot of anarchist socialists would make the argument for a general strike. Georges Sorel was a French anarchist and basically was convinced that eventually the workers would simply stop working and they would destroy everything. That would quickly, this notion of a grassroots movement would quickly get organized and become more militant over time. And for Marx, there were multiple pathways to the overthrowing of the ruling class. They may included a general strike that would cripple the economy and bankrupt the capitalists almost overnight. The second could be a bloody civil war, replete with defecting military units, resulting in the defeat of the capitalists. And third, the unlikely possibility of a bloodless revolution through free and fair elections. What would come next would be what Marx characterized as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Much like the bourgeoisie rose from a persecuted class to become the power behind the throne, the proletariat would become the ruling class. What would be the overarching interests of workers? It would be primarily to preserve the revolution and to prevent a counter-revolution. Marx was convinced the proletariat would be democratic within the proletariat. It would be a dictatorship of and by, but not over, the proletariat. Later revolutionary Marxists like Lenin, again, would say the same thing. He would argue that within the Bolshevik Party, we are democratic. Outside the Bolshevik Party, it is do as I say or we will shoot you. One of the most controversial aspects of Marx's argument is this idea that eventually, over time, you would see a withering away of the state. This is fleshed out in what was, and we'll talk more about this in our next presentation. It came out in his critique of the Gotha program, which was written in 1875 but was not published until 1891. And so this would be a transitional period in which old competitive ways of thinking would eventually, they'd be working on them, but you'd still have to have the use of money as a way of incentivizing people to change their fundamental ways of looking at the world. And so Marx would argue that within this period, you would have the socialist principle, from each according to his ability, to each according to his labor. So again, it's not a something for nothing kind of argument. It's important to keep in mind that, and he doesn't really say how long this dictatorship of the proletariat will last. And finally, we get to the terminal stage of Marx's revolutionary sequence, and that is communism. And that is, that was an argument that he had to first and foremost, it's not going to take any determined form. He didn't want to write the recipes for the kitchen of the future. He argued that the shape of communism in the future would be determined by the people who would inhabit it. But eventually they would come to a different distributive rule. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And again, at that point, what's happened? What has happened is, again, socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat has successfully suppressed all counter-revolutionary or reactionary impulses, and has fundamentally retrained human nature so that everyone is inclined to work and to identify a job that gives them pleasure, and people are naturally inclined to only take that which they need. That's the assumption of those are the moral psychological ideas that are driving Marxism, that eventually human beings can be perfected sufficiently that they will automatically work at things that they love, and that they only will take what they need. And the reason for all this is that eventually all of humanity will be working towards, becoming their best selves, self-realization, self-actualization. Marx believed that within communism, no one would be tied to any particular form of employment. This is a quote from the German Ideology written in 1846. In communist society, where no one has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another thing tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I please without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic. Again, this sounds like a great world, right? Where you get to do whatever you want, but whatever it is that you want is going to be something that will contribute to the common good. Talk about an invisible hand, right? There would be no state. And again, this reflects this general tendency in late 19th century theory from the far left to the far right to believe that the end point of politics is no government, right? And they've all got this Seinfeld yada 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 moment where we're just here's the recipe, and then at the end, communism. It'll be great. No problems whatsoever. So that's Marxism in a nutshell. Now ask yourself, why did it become called Marxism? What branding exercise led to it becoming, being named after this one person who was, admittedly a dominant personality, an incredibly well-educated, that dude produced thousands of pages of densely written work in a fairly short period of time, between 1842 really and around 1876 or 77, because really for the last 7 or 8 years of his life, his health really didn't allow him to do a lot of work or a lot of reading. I'll talk more about his health issues in our next presentation.
But first and foremost, it reflected the sense in which, and a natural human tendency, and the ease with which Marx was effectively demonized by opponents both of the left and the right. The reactionaries looked at a guy that was such a dominant figure within socialism and were able to, again, smear all of socialism with one name, Marx. But Marx had his enemies on the left, too. A lot of socialists were also anarchists and were equally committed to the view that the state would go away. But for them, they thought this notion of a dictatorship, that was, in effect, that's where it would stop, that it would become authoritarianism. And so we'll talk more about some of his opponents, within socialism in our next presentation. But again, in part, it reflects this notion to which, and the extent to which, Marx provided this incredibly elegant synthesis of philosophy and science. A seemingly all-encompassing ideology that explains the past and predicts the future. So I'll conclude with this question. If you want to know why Marx, why socialism became Marxism, why do you think the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act of 2010 quickly became Obamacare? Very similar forces were at play. Again, it's very easy to tie up a broader argument within the person, within one personality, and then, freeze that personality and use it to, as an avenue of attack. And so we shouldn't be surprised that Marx is a dominant figure within socialism. He was a very effective promulgator of his ideas alongside of Engels. But he was also human, and he was very frail, and eventually he succumbed to the rigors of life in exile. What comes next is what happened to Marxist doctrine after Marx passes, and what happens to socialism as other people begin to kind of work within that ideological framework. It's important to keep in mind that any particular, kind of human idea, you're always going to get factionalization, and you're always going to get people reinterpreting, things in ways that are departures from what was, from what the original thinkers may have thought. Remember what I said about Marx with regard to the French Marxists. If that's Marxism, I'm not a Marxist. I'll see you next time.